I'm John Atack. This is my guest, Richard Turner. Is that right? Have I got your name right?
Yep,
It was a good
right,
start, isn't it? And you belong to a dangerous authoritarian cult group. You left that. You are now a counsellor helping people who are recovering from that sort of experience. And you took the master's degree in coercive control at Salford University with Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall. And so that gives some vague shape. You came to me because you were diagnosed on the autistic spectrum, which I should think was tremendously helpful in understanding what was happening in your world. I'm fascinated by, I have the kind of systematizing aspect of Asperger's. One of my brothers tells me that he color codes his socks so they'll never get lonely. They'll always stay in pairs and be. There's 6 pairs of black socks. These ones with the red dot, these ones with the yellow dot, what have you. And that was one of the things that first made me aware that as well as reading Simon Baron-Cohen, that we all are somewhere or other on the spectrum. You came to me with the idea that it may be that people on the spectrum are more vulnerable to recruitment. So why don't you kick off with some of that? Tell me something about that.
So with my, just to give a bit of a background as well, my autism diagnosis came after being in the cult group, and it was part of my asking questions about what happened to me, why am I the way why am I the way I am, and reflecting on it. I suppose the cult experience kind of maybe reassess everything in my whole life. So my autism diagnosis has been part of a healing process for me as well. Because as you might be aware, part of the control in a cult group is that people think that they're the problem. It's not the group.
Of course.
There's guilt and shame, and that guilt and shame is part of the control mechanisms. And actually getting the diagnosis helped me think, there are things about me, and it's not my fault. I was wired certain ways, I act certain ways, I've got vulnerabilities, and this isn't my fault. And it was very, very healing. But in terms of cult groups, to begin with, my view of autism is that, and there's a phrase that floats around in the autistic community that I hear quite a bit, is if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Everybody is so unique. There are similarities in traits, and people have them in a little bit of a different way. I don't have some traits as strong, as noticeable as other autistic people, but there are certain things about me which other autistic people might not have as much. So very briefly, an overview of my autism is incredibly fixated, obsessive interests. But I have sensory processing problems, which means I have to wear tinted glasses if I'm in front of a computer. This computer now has got a dim screen because I'm so sensitive to light. I touch, tastes, things like that. Very, very sensitive to those things. Struggle with social interaction with people. Now, what I find is small talk is very difficult. Like, I don't know what people are expecting of me when they're talking to me. I have learned over the years scripts. If someone says, "How are you?" I go, "I'm okay. How are you?" And it's a script I have in my head. It's not a natural response often. So I find that anything social is quite challenging. I can't get very good eye contact, which you can't tell on here, because fortunately what online interactions mean is that it's much easier for me to engage actually than in real life. So especially in a social way, you wouldn't get much eye contact from me if we were face to face. That's very, very brief. With autism, you get struggle with social things, sensory processing things, fixed routines. But with that as well, there's a lot of anxiety. Things feel like out of control with me. If they seem like it's vague, I often don't understand like vagueness, or if routine isn't compartmentalized in boxes, I get very anxious. So, that's a very brief overview of my autism, because I could talk about that for 2 hours straight easily, but I didn't want to dominate the video with that. But in terms of the cult experience, you know, it's very common for people, especially with undiagnosed autism, to get bullied a lot in school, not fit in, feel like there's something wrong with them, really struggle with self-esteem and things like that. So to begin with, you know, as you're well aware, it's quite understandable that love bombing is very effective for somebody on the spectrum, because having a lifetime of feel like you don't fit in and all of a sudden you feel like you do, it's massive. To the point where in the group I was in, when I remember now distinctly just being in tears because of the love bombing, because you're so great, you're doing so good, we're so great to have you on, it's grateful to have you on board, we can see great things for your future. And in coming from being in high school where I didn't even want to go into the canteen to eat because I didn't like being around people, and I hid in the music practice room, and then I started going home, and I was frightened of going in every day, and it's just really low self-esteem. And all of a sudden these people just full on telling you the great things about yourself, and that was a big thing to begin with. And that's one of the things that made me defend them and kind of almost made me suppress those gut feelings that you often get when you meet a cult member where you think something doesn't feel right here, because they were being so nice. Now, obviously, lots of people, generally speaking, go through similar experiences, but I sensed that the struggles I had prior to being involved in a cult group, it made me a little bit more vulnerable in that area. So the other challenging thing, I think, as well, is I tend to find that I trust people, take people at face value, and see almost, you know, people with Asperger's, how you want to pronounce that, tend to be very honest and struggle to understand that other people aren't honest. Now, again, that doesn't apply for every autistic person, but it's a common trait. And I found that people have said to me, "Richard, you're so honest. You're too honest. People don't know how to take you sometimes." And I, as I've reflected on my experience linked in with the cult, I started to wonder, was I projecting that honesty onto other people, and I assumed everybody else was honest, and there was no deception? I know you've mentioned deception in one of your recent videos as well. The not realizing that there were other motives, not realizing that actually this is about getting me involved and then coercing me to become more committed and take a lot of my money, was a big thing. So that was another vulnerability I picked up in myself. What's quite helpful for me in life is when things are really clear. And I tend to find I have a natural tendency for black and white thinking anyway. I like things to be rigid and clear. I actually get anxious quite a lot if things feel like vague and confusing. And to protect myself, try and make things really clear. So what I've done is studying a lot of psychology that has helped me understand relationships, understand people, things that are often a bit abstract. But the problem is in cult groups, as you're quite familiar with, I'm sure, things are clear. You know, here's the rules, here's what you need to follow, here's what you need to do. And that actually, I sense, probably made me more vulnerable as well. I remember the exact moment being around people and the control started to kick in. Like you must learn to submit to the leadership was the common phrase. And I remember actually feeling warmth from it and like peace from the control in the early days until it started costing me something. But I remember feeling it was amazing how much attention I got. I remember feeling actually this maybe isn't so bad, this bit of control, because I feel safe. I feel like I get where I am. So there was a few things really, and also I suspect one of the challenges in, you know, some of my experiences prior to that is struggling to stand up for myself, struggling to speak out. I had an assessment by an educational psychologist when around the time I got diagnosed with autism, and he said that the processing speed of my brain was quite slow, which means I can't think very quick on my feet. Now, as you know, cults want quick decisions. In the moment, they want you know, you're backed into the corner. Everything's very quick. Someone does something, and it takes a long time. For me, it takes a long time to think something wasn't right then. It happened so quick. I just go along with it. I very often will go along with something and not realize what is actually happening until much later, because I can't think quick enough. So in day-to-day life, you know, when I was studying, tutors can't ask me questions in lessons because I need to take a week thinking about it, because I can't think very quick on my feet at all. And I feel that also may be quite vulnerable because everything happens so quick. People will push boundaries, they'll ask invasive questions, and there was a tendency to answer, you know, straight away without thinking, why are they asking me that? But also because of the low self-esteem, and as a coping mechanism, learning to be quiet, learning to survive as well, alongside that submissiveness because of the environment I've been in at high school. Together, those two things again made me very vulnerable, I think, to recruitment. In addition, some positive traits I think that come with autism is like when I'm passionate about something, the blinkers go on completely. I can't see anything. In my job, I will work until everything is finely tuned, until it is very clear. It's all in a structure. And if if I love it, sorry, got a bit of a cough. If I love it, I can't see anything outside of that. For example, why are my wages so low? For example, you know, I need the money from this job to live, and not realizing when I'm giving it all back to them, because it was a church that run a charity. I was working for the charity and attending the church, so they were paying me. The money was just going back in a loop. But I was so focused on what I was doing, I didn't see the other stuff around the side. And I think that may be quite vulnerable. I think they were looking for people who were so passionate and focused to use, to exploit, basically. And I was, you know, kind of taken in by it all. And generally speaking, because of that autistic trait, that focus, when things click, they really do click, and you can't. There was times when people have said to me, even now, Richard, you have to charge people for what you're doing. You can't do it for free. I know you're really passionate, but you've got to put a value on your time. And sometimes I can be so enthusiastic, I won't, you know, make that connection.
Yeah.
So I think that was another trait that kind of made me more susceptible. And, you know, so you've got the kind of, it's quite black and white, it's quite comfortable and quite focused if I get excited about something, you know, and don't notice people's motives very well. And I tend to kind of, with the self-esteem struggles that often come with being autistic, love bombing worked past it, you know, quite well. So, yeah, I mean, that was the question. Sorry, was specifically about recruitment, wasn't it? You just asked. That was about recruitment.
I'm fascinated by everything you said, and I think it points to, you know, the notion of a spectrum that
Yeah.
I can recognise some of what you're saying in myself. That I too, when I become passionate about something, I become fairly fervent about it, and it excludes or diminishes my view of other things. Reflecting on what you say about love bombing, it's fascinating because it's not something that I responded to in the same way, probably because I come from a very securely attached family.
Yeah.
You know, 3 brothers. You know, my mum was a very loving person, and I was, you know, I'd been a very sociable child throughout school. You know, so it's interesting to reflect on the similarities and the differences. So the love bombing aspect, which was certainly there in Scientology right from the start, didn't mean as much to me, probably because I was used to being encouraged and receiving compliments from people. And I think in that I was very fortunate, because I think elsewhere I've talked about encouragement and discouragement in our society, and talked about my friend Rachel Bernstein, who teaching a class of adults, she said to them, write down a time you were encouraged at school and a time you were discouraged. And it's a few years ago that I taught with her, but I'm not sure that anybody could remember in their 13 years of schooling in the United States being encouraged, even once. So I think it's a terrible deficit. We're also talking about the ability to assert ourselves. And that's something that I learned probably after. I think I was probably normally assertive, which is not enough in my experience. But I've learned to say no when I mean no. And I've learned that I don't have to explain myself to anybody, unless they've got a gun or an arrest warrant. So I can just go, I'm not interested, so if somebody cold calls me on the telephone, I can just tell them I'm not interested and they ought to get a proper job, and I hope they're able to get a proper job, but those are learned things. As you talk about scripts, which is one of the things that fascinates me with, what little I know about the autistic spectrum, the idea that if somebody is looking a little bit distressed, you offer them a warm beverage, you can learn these things. I have a friend who probably, is quite some way on the spectrum, who, what you say about slow processing, he's one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. He's one of the most educated and informed people I've ever met. But I've had to point out to him that he thinks before he answers questions. I don't do that. I just answer them and regret the consequences later. But he will. So he's difficult to interview because you ask him something, he has to sort of think about it, and then he'll give you a supremely intelligent response to it. And through that, I learned that intelligence, whatever that is not dependent on how fast people think, which is an idea that's built into Scientology. Hubbard talks about the communication lag. How long it takes you to answer something is how bright you are. And I found that people like me who do answer quickly don't usually get it as right as people like you who take their time to think something through. So, I think what you've hit the mark. You said so much in such a short period of time that I find so fascinating. And what can we do about that, do you think, in terms of you are seeking to alert the community to this problem? What have you been able to do so far, and what would you like to do?
Just picking up what you said there and then going on to the question, what I found as well is my ability to answer now is this is on my mind so much. I've spent months already thinking about it. So normally I wouldn't be able to answer, but I think what you're seeing now is my coping mechanisms from going from my brain out of my mouth. Understanding it has been how I've survived. So, there's a couple of things really. One of the things, so as well as the counselling, I do deliver training on this. I've done different talks. So I'm a teacher as well. So I teach counselling. So I've taught some of this to my counselling students and in a college I used to work at. And such a big education is such a big thing. And I just find that people just aren't aware that this kind of thing goes on. It seems like some strange out there thing that cult groups or totalitarian groups or whatever terminology people want to use, it's like it seems rare. And I just the big thing I think is just educating people, so you know how to spot when and listen to your gut, and if something doesn't feel right, why doesn't it feel right, and recognizing love bombing and recognizing when people are pushing boundaries too quick, very quickly. What do they want from you, and how much do they want, and how quick do they want it? And I think a big part of this is education. Now I've been through that, and then I studied the masters in. I can spot things really easy because I've learned how to spot it. And I think the big thing is education. For me, it needs to be taught. It's a safeguarding thing. It needs to be taught to educational organisations, schools, colleges. so tutors can pick up on it. So it's in the lessons as well. I think it really needs to become a normal thing to talk about. Cult recruitment or extremism recruitment, although it is in some areas actually, but less so in groups that aren't as obviously, it's more where it's more covert. So I think education is a big part of this. So far I've been running my practice since January 2019, so it's a new practice, if you like. But I've offered advice and guidance for people ringing up, and I've done some training courses, and of course the lockdown's made it a bit more difficult. So I really try doing what I can outside of my main job, because the cult stuff is like a top-up job on top of my teaching job. Really just to educate people. I mean, as well, hoping that they go on to educate more people, and they go on to, rather than trying to do it on my own as well. So that's a big thing as well, I think, really, in terms of how to deal with it. Education is the key, I think, in my opinion.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think part of it is this notion that there are these strange, exotic, fringe, weirdo groups out there that are cults. And the reality is, as Margaret Singer pointed out in the title of the book she wrote with Jan Jeleilich, Cults in Our Midst, that we live in a society, and I use the word cult, I seek to use it in its proper sense, which is an attachment to a belief system or an individual. It's not necessarily a negative thing. Sadly, the words become negative and we have to say what kind of cult we mean.
Yeah.
And for me, the terminology gets in the way, the words get in the way. We were talking about education and the need for education. And I think the first thing is to say that my concern is not for cult groups. I couldn't care less about cult groups. What I care about is authoritarian behavior. And wherever that appears, wherever there is, this abuse of power where somebody is bullying somebody else. And for me, authoritarianism is there, there are two forms. There's the leader form and the follower form. And leaders are bullies, people who are abusive and push other people around. Every cult leader I've studied, and over the years, that's a lot. Cult leaders, gang leaders, terrorist leaders, hundreds of them I've looked at over the last 40 years since I started looking at this. And they all fit into one of the various antisocial types of personality. They're narcissistic, malignant narcissists, or people with the Machiavellian disorder, if we can get into that. The many and various definitions of sociopaths and psychopaths. They will have the characteristics that fit there, in that they use and abuse other people. And we find that in personal relationships. There are kind of small, one-person cults where a spouse is subjected to horrible abuse, coercive control. And then there are huge groups like North Korea, for example, where you've got virtually most of the population locked into this thinking. I mean, it's been put to me that the same is true of China. I do not believe that. I believe there's a great deal of dissent in China, but in North Korea, you have an authoritarian regime. I don't think it has to become totalitarian. It doesn't have to be total authority. I think there's a point where authority is just wrong, and our educational system fails to teach kids how to recognize the characteristics of what I call human predators. And I think what shocks me the most is you can pretty much teach somebody in about 10 minutes how to recognize this. It isn't complicated. It ain't brain science, though there is brain science involved in it, obviously, if we get But so I think rolling out an education, and I've come to a frustration, which is that our educational system is the problem. It's not part of the problem, it is the problem. That kids are being trained not to assert themselves. They're not being allowed to express themselves. It's getting better. When I was a kid, you could still be flogged for saying something they didn't like. I saw a kid being picked up by his ear once off the ground. I've never forgotten that. So that kind of abuse is, and that was a very prestigious school, that's gone. And the shouting seems to be diminishing in schools a little bit. But understanding, some Swedish teachers came over, and of course, Scandinavia always scores very well on the 2 yearly tests of schools around the world. And that they were very surprised at UK schools, these Swedish teachers, because the first thing, there were all these things hanging from the ceiling, all these little mobiles and all of this stuff on the walls. And they were saying, well, if you're on the spectrum, this would be really quite overwhelming, you know. I find it with modern textbooks that they print textbooks in multiple colors. So you've got violet text and pink text and yellow text. I can't read them. You know, give me black and white, I can read that, but I don't. Some part of me is perhaps trying to interpret why are they these colors? What is there some meaning that I'm missing that green text is meant to tell me? So overwhelming the senses is a standard aspect of education here, which for anybody, you know, as I said, that affects me. So I think it probably does affect quite a lot of people. It will inevitably affect somebody who's on the autistic spectrum.
And the interesting thing, so I only did my teacher training recently as well as the masters. And what's interesting, the way teaching has changed. You know, it used to be sit down, the teacher talks, you copy a textbook, and now in a positive way, teaching is more about engaging critical thinking, teaching people how to think, which I think is positive in terms of getting people to question things. Is this right? What's wrong with this? What do you think about this? And that I think that's been a positive change in terms of teaching, but that's only recently. So most of the way I teach is asking questions and getting students to critically analyse. What do you think about this theory? Do you agree? Do you not agree? But that's only fairly recent, really, in teaching. You know, but in terms of spotting unhealthy relationships, activating critical thinking, you know, of course, it's transferable, isn't it? So that's something positive, I think, going on in education though as well.
I mean, the idea of, you know, engaging the person rather than filling their head with facts that they can check on Google like anybody else now. That's something that Matthew Lipman I often, where's it gone? Thinking in Education. Here we are. This is a 40-year-old book. And we have, of course, Sir Ken Robinson's The Elements in Creative Schools, where something interesting is happening, which is that the psychology that was developed in the 1960s and 70s is finally being used. You know, the paradigm shift in education has taken so long. And unfortunately, along the way, we've acquired the national curriculum and the kind of neoliberal box ticking of everything being measured. So that while there's the idea of engaging more with the pupil, getting the pupil to engage with the subject is a different matter altogether. I've got two boys one's he finished his GCSEs, and the other has finished his A-levels. And because they both have a sleep disorder, meaning they're not able to go to school, it's meant I've had to be very involved with what they were doing. And I'm horrified by the textbooks in the curriculum. I'm horrified at the errors of information in psychology, sociology, biology, even history that I'm seeing. And this idea that you're going to cram this information into somebody. I'll give you a specific about this. When he was doing GCSEs, my son Sam was studying Macbeth. I personally think there should be a restriction so that teenagers are not exposed to suicidal and maniacal work. You know, they shouldn't read Kafka at GCSE, and they shouldn't read Macbeth, even though it does have the most beautiful suicide soliloquy ever delivered. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps forth this petty pace of time. While he was doing that, read a book called, which was recommended to me by somebody at a comment section on a video or something, called 1606, a year in the life of Shakespeare's Lear. I think it's called something like that. And it was absolutely brilliant, his book, because here we are at 1606. Why is he writing Macbeth? He's got a Scottish king. The king doesn't like plays. He's just imprisoned the other king's players, the children's players, all of them, all the kids, everybody. They're all in prison because he hates plays and he thinks they've been nasty about him. He's published a book called Demonology. in which he asserts his tremendous belief in spirit possession. So he doesn't like plays. He's likely to put you in prison. Oh dear. Let's have a Scottish subject, because he's Scottish. He believes he's descended from Banquo. And indeed, there's an armorial thing that, that shows you generation by generation what he believed. It's from his time. The only place in all of Shakespeare that killings happen off stage is in Macbeth. And they're both kings of Scotland who are killed. So there's a certain, we've got to be careful about this. Then we go, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. That was the November before. That was November the 5th, 1605, the year before the play is written. In the February of 1606, there's a rumour throughout England that James has been killed. And this is the environment in which we get hubble, bubble, toil and trouble and all of this stuff. My son lost points in his exam for knowing that, because those are not accepted points of information about Macbeth. So the encouragement of engagement is kind of robotically stopped by the marking process. I'm absolutely with you. We need to get kids to engage and explore and be able to assert themselves. I'm hugely interested in the work of Erich Fromm, and who was the man who gave us the notion of the malignant narcissist in a book called The Heart of Man in the 60s. And he has this basic idea, which he puts forward in his first book, Escape from Freedom, from 1941. And he says 60% of people do not develop a self.
Yeah.
And this is, I just stopped. What a brilliant way of looking at this, saying, let's forget mental illness. Let's forget about where we are in any spectrum. How grown up are we? There's a woman called Patricia Crittenden who wrote a book called Raising Parents, in which she talks about a therapy that pushes away all diagnostic criteria and just except for how grown up are you? And she's dealing with sexual abusers, incestuous child molesters, and distinguishing them from other forms of abuser, in saying that what she has found is that they simply haven't grown up. They don't understand that what they're doing is not a loving thing at all. It's an abusive thing that they're doing. And that by helping them to mature, you can bring them to a point where they realize that this is not something they should be doing, and they stop doing it. But that idea of maturity is very important. And I think that our educational system is actually maintaining children at a low level of maturity.
It reminds me of, things I've reflected on a lot in terms of, how important it is to know who you are and develop your own identity that isn't being pushed upon you. And when I was kind of recovering from my experience and also the way I support my clients, a lot of it is building up that, what do you want? What do you believe? What do you understand? Who are you? And building that up almost as well. What you said kind of reminds me a little bit of that. But I think as well, part of my recovery from my experience was actually going back and asking who I am, and learning to listen to the inner me, because for so long it had been, pushed down. And you just kind of reminded me of that, really. Big part of me recovering was asking that question, because even before the experience, I don't think he even really knew, and knew how to trust my own thoughts and think, what do I think about this really? Can I trust what I think? And it's been massive that, because I think that because I grew up in a religious environment as well before the cult-like experience. I'd almost learned to not really trust my own thoughts and feelings and value them in the same way. So what you're saying does remind me of that a little bit in terms of who is the real, what's my real self, the organismic self, Rogers would have said, what is that? How do I listen to that?
And I mean, you said before that what tends to happen, and what makes an authoritarian group authoritarian, is that the enemy is within you. You are your own enemy, and the group is going to help you, and they're going to make you who they want you to be. They're not going to make you who you want to be. In Scientology, you have this conflict where it's meant to be about achieving self-determinism, complete and absolute self-determinism. The only time that you can actually achieve that is by doing exactly what Ron Hubbard says.
Yeah.
I didn't notice that in my 9 years of membership, and when it dawned on me, I felt a little embarrassed that there was such an obvious situation.
Yeah,
it fits into education because the teachers we loved, if there were any teachers that we loved, were the ones who did encourage us to feel and think and be who we are. And something that's very important to me, and I've written about it in various places, but I wrote a novel called Voodoo Child's Slight Return, in which I brought Jimi Hendrix back to life, because that's what that felt like a good idea at the time. But the core of the novel is the idea that everybody has their own genius, not their own talent, their own genius. Everybody can excel at something.
Yeah.
And that's an experience I've had with people with Down syndrome, with anybody and everybody, that there's some perception of the world that anybody I meet will have that can inform and educate me. It doesn't matter how much I know. A 5-year-old child can point my attention at something that I hadn't realized. And having that sense about human beings, believing that human life is absolutely precious and wonderful. And again, Eric Fromm has this simple that people are either life denying or life affirming, and he explains that you can be life denying in some ways and life affirming in other ways. And sometimes it's, when it comes to mosquitoes, it's good to be life denying as far as I'm concerned. They don't deserve to live. But just thinking of things in those terms of what is affirming to our own lives, to me as an individual, who am I? And where I, as a kid, I believed that I could achieve enlightenment, which is one of the things that made me vulnerable to Scientology, the Buddhist idea of enlightenment. I no longer believe that. I couldn't care less about that. All I care about is being me now, and doing what I can to help other people, because selfishly, absolutely selfishly, I realized that helping other people is what makes me feel happy. So I don't do it for the other people. I couldn't care less about it.
One of the things I really love about counselling people who've been in cult-like controlling groups or controlling situations is when they start thinking about what they want and they start dreaming and they start saying, I'm going to do this and I've never been able to do this before. And it's so exciting to see that to emerge in the therapy, that when they start realising that they can start thinking about who they want to be and where they want to go or where they want to travel to and all that. It's one of the best things, seeing someone grow and come from that, where they were so controlled, where they weren't able to develop that individuality, and watching it happen. And as it dawns on them that they can get excited about themselves is great experience. I
couldn't agree more. And watching people come away from that awful thing where, you go to the restaurant with them and they say, what do you think I should have? That kind of, that somebody kind of submitted so much into a group, and that's very often the case. Okay. I think maybe we've covered some ground, and maybe leave it there, but I would like to come back and talk again. And what I'm seeing all around the world at the moment is a heightened perception that there is something going wrong, that our society has become polarized. In the US, it's come to a head with QAnon and Trump. And so my good friend Steve Hassan is suddenly getting an incredible barrage of media. He published a book 2 years ago about the cult of Trump, and he's ignored by the media. It's an excellent book. Now with cult, now that the witch is gone, and it's safe, he's getting all of this media. And the question is being asked, in fact, a Republican at the beginning of these impeachment hearings of Trump put forward the idea that it was ridiculous that they were suggesting that Republicans should be taken away and deprogrammed. And, I don't like the concept of deprogramming. I don't think people are programmed. I think we're a lot more subtle than that.
Oh, yeah.
Putting aside the word, I absolutely believe the whole society needs to be deprogrammed. The whole society needs to be brought to a place where we do think more critically, where we are aware of the power that certainty holds over us, that we become sure and absolutely convinced of things that we don't have evidence for, which we are seeing so much of, with the COVID-19. People who are, there's a guy who sat up in bed and the last thing he said before dying of COVID-19 was, "There's no such thing as COVID-19." And it's very hard to argue with that kind of, and that comes from a lack of education, and that comes from having an educational system that is not focused upon the development of the individual, but is focused upon the control of the society over the individual, and the erroneous belief that it is necessary to control people all the time. That I think socially we can do rather better than that, and should.
Yeah, and the attempts to control it, to make things better, actually makes things worse because people then don't know who they are, struggle to express themselves. Mental health starts deteriorating because they're repressing themselves. Speaking very generally, repress themselves and their feelings, and it actually doesn't help. Yeah.
No, and it's a contagion. We live in a society. I can't remember, one of the Himalayan countries, it may be Nepal, has declared that they're no longer interested in gross national product. It was some years ago they did this. They're interested in gross national happiness. And so they issue surveys to see how people feel about things. And having watched the growth economy all these years, going, but this is destroying the environment. What do you mean growth economy? This may, talking of Asperger's, we have Greta Thunberg, and this. I'm about halfway through watching I Am Greta, and I'm just amazed that she is so incredibly intelligent. She has that wonderful autistic gift of information, that she can store huge amounts of information and correlate it. But the thought that she, as a small child, stopped eating because at 5 years old or whatever, she could see how stupid it was what the adults were doing. And I think there's a clarity of perception that can sometimes come with autism that seems to be completely lost on other people. You're going, but this is rather obvious, isn't it?
Yeah. And interestingly, almost going full circle back to the start of our conversation, that's why I didn't last very long in my cult, because I saw this isn't right. And my experience, the worst part of it only lasted 6 to 8 months because I couldn't, because of the injustice sense.
Yeah.
So that's part of how I ended up getting out, because I couldn't obey them. I couldn't obey the leadership because it was an injustice, and that's actually how I ended up. It made me quite ill trying to mentally battle against that. But that fixation on justice, that this isn't right, that I have, probably influenced by being autistic, is part of how I got out as well, because I couldn't accept what the leadership was saying as being just, and I couldn't accept the control. When the dial was turned up on the control, which is what happened, became more controlling. I pushed back, and in some ways, I suppose that's why autism might actually protect people for staying in too long, and maybe a more positive thing as well. So that's kind of come full circle, I suppose, a bit there. It helped me get out as well.
And it's how I left Scientology. It was a sense of injustice. It's simply that there were rules and the rules weren't being followed. And when I complained that the rules weren't being followed, I didn't get an answer. And, I actually spent 6 months writing, going up lines, as they say in Scientology. So you're going higher up the hierarchy until eventually at the time Ron Hubbard was still alive, and there was this farce that you could write letters to him, and there was a whole unit, that answered the letters to Ron. And I found myself here, because the last recourse in Scientology was Hubbard. What had happened was a good friend of mine had been declared suppressive, and I'd been told I couldn't communicate with him. And I said, nobody tells me who I communicate with. That's up to me, which was not well liked. And I then went to the Justice Chief, the International Justice Chief, all of these people. And I eventually found myself writing a letter to Ron Hubbard saying, I know that you do not receive these letters, but this is the last recourse. And the response was, your letter is on my desk. Of course I receive my letters.
Yeah.
As to the problem of my friend having been thrown into the outer darkness, that was another matter. And I left because, as you say, maybe that straightforward idea of what is fair and is not fair is something that you and I share. And it saved us, but because we were not willing to experience that injustice.
Yeah. It's almost like the rules they're good, but they're also, when they're broken, can't cope with it. So even when the rules are bad rules, that this is the rule and this is the way you've got to do it. We've accepted these rules. And as we both know, in abusive relationships, while there will be micro rules, there'll be all sorts of rules. You'll never actually be able to fulfill them. You'll never actually be able to do it. But it it gives us something to keep obsessing about, to keep trying to do, until the point where we realize that the demands upon us are absolutely impossible and that nobody can meet them. Okay, well, this has been a tremendous pleasure, and we'll talk again hopefully in a few weeks' time, and sure.
Get some, think more about what prepare yourself to what you'd like to talk about, because I've been quite fascinated by everything you said today. It's making me think,
Thank you.
So I'm John Atack, and this is my new friend, Richard Turner. And thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.